a war veteran struck by a mysterious, life-threatening illness.
His sugar had dropped in a matter of minutes. That sent him into cardiac arrest.
He was non-diabetic, and there was absolutely no reason for his blood sugar to be low.
As investigators dig into the mystery, a disturbing pattern comes to light.
There were events with a number of patients of unexplained hypoglycemia.
The rumor mill spread around the hospital. It could have been anybody.
It was pretty clear something terrible had gone wrong at this hospital.
All of the deaths in this case occurred in a single unit of the hospital.
To unearth the horrifying truth, investigators must expose a killer preying on a community's most vulnerable members.
These events couldn't be occurring naturally or by accident. This was being done by someone.
Insulin had been administered subcutaneously or injected into the patients.
Did you have anything to do with the deaths or incidents with these patients? Absolutely not.
That's no angel of mercy to me. That's a monster.
Clarksburg, West Virginia is a small town with a proud history. It's home to the Lewis A. Johnson Medical Center, which is one of the 172 veterans hospitals distributed across the United States.
The Lewis A. Johnson Medical Center is a relatively small facility, has approximately 100 beds, and it serves the population of north central West Virginia and surrounding states.
This is a VA hospital that was built after World War II. It sits high on a bluff, and you look down over this gorgeous countryside of West Virginia.
The center serves a vital role in the lives of nearly 70,000 veterans. In June 2018, 92-year-old Russell Posey Sr. becomes the latest to be admitted. But his experience won't be routine.
My sister called me one morning and said that my father was not acting right. He was sick, so she took him to a VA because that's where his doctors were. They didn't diagnose him with anything for the first day. He was in ICU, had low blood pressure with low kidney response. They said his organs were trying to shut down. Eventually, they determined that he had pneumonia, and they treated him for it. He got better in a couple days. That's when they moved him to Section 3A to get just general care, help him get stronger, and then they were going to send him home.
Ward 3A is the hospital's medical surgical unit, where many patients recuperate before release.
That was Father's Day that they transferred him into that ward. We all had a little Father's Day party for him. I stayed with him that night until probably midnight.
With plans to see his father the following morning, Vincent Posey leaves him to rest. But before returning, he receives unsettling news.
The next morning, I got a call from my sister. The hospital had called. They said Dad had been unresponsive in the middle of the night and that he had an episode. She asked the doctors what had happened, and nobody could give her an answer at that time.
While Vincent is en route, doctors have determined Russell Posey Sr.'s blood sugar levels plummeted during the night, resulting in a life-threatening hypoglycemic attack.
A hypoglycemic event is a drop in one's blood sugar level, essentially below 70 is what could be considered a hypoglycemic event.
His sugar had dropped from, I think, approximately 117, 118 down to 14 in a matter of minutes. And that sent him into cardiac arrest.
You can't spend much time with a blood sugar in the 10s or 20s. It is very unusual, and it's incredibly rare. You're going to start considering organ system failures.
Doctors are working feverishly to save Russell's life, but his family is certain nothing in his history explains the crisis.
My father never had any diabetes or sugar issues ever. A little bit of high blood pressure he's being treated for, but never any issues with sugar. The nurses and the doctors were both like, we don't understand what happened.
Russell Posey Sr. was born in Lewis County, West Virginia in 1925. He was raised on a farm, and at the age of 18, like many men of his generation, he answered the call to fight in World War II.
My father joined the Navy in 1943. He went to a group called the Raiders, which, if I understand it correctly, was the predecessor to the SEALs.
Russell was sent to Florida for rigorous training. Upon completion, his unit was selected to perform a dangerous mission.
He was supposed to swim ashore, evade the enemy, draw maps, and check the tides and things like that. But he had boarded the ship, and he was on his way to Japan when they dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By them dropping those bombs, he didn't have to swim ashore and try to map the coast of Japan. He didn't expect to come back home from that. He ended up going to Okinawa, and he was cleaning up the war debris and helping restore, infrastructure.
After the war, Russell returned to the States with a new lease on life. He attended West Virginia University, where he became president of his fraternity and met the love of his life, Nelva.
My mom lived in Morgantown. She was born in Italy and came over when she was 6 years old. And I think that she met him accidentally through another date that she was on. And then he started dating her.
Russell and Nelva were married on December 30th, 1950. They spent the next 55 years together, raising 4 children and building a lasting legacy in their small town.
He bought a drive-in restaurant called the Dairy Delight. That was in 69, 70. And then shortly after that, we opened another business called Posey's Lawn and Garden. And we ran those businesses for about 30 years. The whole family kind of helped out with that. After he quit the businesses when he retired, he moved back to Lewis County onto one of the farms he had owned over there.
After more than half a century of marital bliss, Russell lost the love of his life when Nelva passed away in 2005. Russell struggled to move on and found himself looking for new purpose in his golden years.
When she passed and he was in that house by himself, he didn't like it. So he went to church quite a bit. We kept active with the grandkids coming over as much as we could.
Now, 13 years later, Russell's life hangs in the balance as his family waits for him to regain consciousness in the wake of a deadly hypoglycemic attack.
He had 3 IVs of dextrose, I think, being pumped into him, and they kept checking him like every couple minutes.
Dextrose is a simple sugar that's used as a rescue treatment for low blood sugar. There certainly is potential for survival, but it all depends on the reserve and how quickly that low blood sugar is responded to.
He would fade in and out of consciousness. That went on through that day.
The treatment works, but not without complications.
Later that night, he got to the point where he could talk again and open his eyes and move his arms and stuff like that. He was never the same after that, though. He didn't recognize people. He was talking to people that weren't there. He had gotten stronger enough to where he could be moved to this nursing home, but he was 92. He was never going to get strong enough to where he could live on his own again.
But the Posey family is desperate to understand, how could this have happened?
Mr. Posey was non-diabetic, and he had eaten cheesecake the night before, and there was absolutely no reason for his blood sugar to be low.
So it is a very unusual event for a non-diabetic. Something else is going on.
We have to figure out what could cause severe, catastrophic low blood sugar events and who could have done this.
Coming up, an investigation uncovers a disturbing pattern.
All of these men were in their 80s and 90s. All of them had suffered a very similar hypoglycemic event.
And there seems to be only one terrifying explanation.
The rumor mill spread, and the term angel of death began to present itself.
After Russell Posey Sr.'s unexplained health crisis, administrators conduct a review of the veteran's case and the hospital's procedures. What they find is alarming.
They realized that they had multiple patients that were experiencing the same thing.
There were events with a number of patients of unexplained hypoglycemia. So these patients were experiencing dramatic drops in their blood sugar that couldn't be explained by their underlying condition.
Administrators review records showing there have been 6 hypoglycemic incidents that year. The first occurred in late January 2018. The patient was 89-year-old Robert Kozel.
Robert Kozel was a Korean War veteran who was admitted overnight for non-life-threatening medical issues going on with him. He was not diabetic, but ended up suffering an extreme hypoglycemic event, and he received multiple bouts of D50 dextrose.
He was actually really starting to do much, much better, and his family, one of the last memories they have is singing with him in the hospital bed, and then he dies shortly thereafter.
2 months later, the same thing happened to another Korean War veteran, 84-year-old Archie Edgell.
Archie Edgell was admitted to the hospital in late March 2018 for medical conditions related to dementia and was being held. Ultimately, I think, expected to be discharged from the ward when he suffered an extreme hypoglycemic event.
The 2 cases seemed unrelated at the time, but a third incident made the pattern harder to ignore. On March 22, 2018, 81-year-old George Shaw Sr. checked into the hospital, expecting the quality care he'd grown accustomed to after decades in the armed forces.
My father joined the service when he was 18. He joined the Air Force, and he stayed in the Air Force for 28 years before he retired and moved back here. And then after that, he worked for the VA for 6 years in the mailroom. My father was an honest man, a caring man.
In his later years, Shaw struggled with short-term memory loss, often forgetting to eat and drink.
That particular day, he was dizzy, lightheaded. We decided to take him to the VA to be seen. The doctors wanted to just keep him in the hospital over the weekend, and then he was going to go home. No big deal.
Like those before him, Shaw's blood sugar suddenly plummeted without an explanation as to why.
Every organ in his body was starting to shut down. And he kept trying to tell us something the whole time. He kept pointing that finger, and trying to talk. And We knew he was trying to tell us something, but we didn't know what for sure. It took him 2 weeks. 2 weeks to pass away. He suffered. Organ after organ after organ shut down. The doctors didn't give us an explanation because they were confused. They didn't understand why his sugar dropped that low. We thought somebody had gave him the wrong medicine on accident. We thought it was just a big mistake.
However, the incident still went unreported.
There were members of the hospital staff who privately and among themselves wondered what was going on and became very, very alarmed. But VA hospitals generally have a culture that really makes it very hard for people to come forward.
2 more deaths occurred in April 2018, 2 months before Russell's hypoglycemic event. A 96-year-old veteran listed under the initials WAH and 82-year-old Felix McDermott.
My dad was talkative, he was friendly. Man never forgot a joke. He went right into the service after high school, and then he was a paratrooper. He was 25 years old, and he was with the 101st at one point in the 82nd Airborne, and he got out after a year in Vietnam. And then he rejoined when my brother joined. And finished out his years in the reserves. He was military to the core. He always told us after my mom passed, if anything happens to me, I want you to put me in a VA nursing home.
Similar to the other patients, McDermott's condition was not life-threatening when he was admitted.
He had gotten food down in his lungs when he was eating dinner, and he had developed pneumonia from it. He went in on a Friday. By Sunday, he was doing a lot better. The antibiotic was doing its job. I told him, hey, Dad, I'm going to go back to work. You should be going home tomorrow. We got called in Sunday night, and they tell us that Dad's sugar had failed. It bottomed out, and it come down to my dad's DNR. So choice was made to let him pass. My dad never had problems with the sugar until that night. That was the first time ever.
2 months later, 88-year-old Raymond Golden would become the 6th man to die from a hypoglycemic event.
By the time June had come around, the investigators were confronted with 6 deaths of elderly male veterans.
They all ranged in age from 72 to 96. They all had health problems. They were in the hospital for one reason or another. They were all on the upswing and expecting to be discharged.
Russell Posey Sr. is the only one of these men who survived. And now that hospital administrators are aware of the problem, they finally take action.
When they could not find a medical explanation, they referred the matter for criminal investigation by the Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General.
We investigate allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse pertaining to VA programs and facilities. This investigation was first brought to our attention on the evening of June 27th, 2018. One of the first things that we tried to do was go to the medical experts to figure out what could have been the root cause of this. And what the medical experts were indicating was that only insulin could lower these sugars that severely.
So it was determined that these hypoglycemic events couldn't be occurring naturally or by accident. This was being done by someone.
The facts describe a horrifying scenario. Someone inside the hospital, most likely a caregiver, has been using insulin as a lethal weapon.
The term angel of death began to present itself early in the investigation, and the rumor mill spread around the hospital once everyone heard that there was an ensuing investigation. The fact that it was a series of inpatients over a short span The thought process, of course, crosses your mind that do we have a serial killer on our hands?
After initial findings suggest a caregiver could be killing patients at a veterans hospital in West Virginia, additional resources are immediately committed to the investigation.
The Veterans Affairs Office Inspector General joined with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office to begin a criminal investigation.
The VA Medical Center in Clarksburg, the facility at any point in time has approximately 1,200 employees. There were any number of employees who could have had access to any of these patients at any point in time. It could have been anybody.
Agents try to narrow down the pool of suspects by analyzing patterns in the suspicious deaths.
All of the deaths in this case occurred in a single unit of the hospital called Ward 3A.
3A wasn't like an intensive care unit or anything like that for people expected to die. It was general medicine where people were recovering and expecting to be discharged.
Employees, you have to scan their cards in order to access different access points. So they immediately start checking timesheets, particularly for folks who worked on or had access to Ward 3A.
Only one person fits all of the requirements.
Upon further review of the Ward 3A time card records, we learned that Reta Mays was the only 3A employee that was working when all of the hypoglycemic events occurred. Reta Mays was a nursing assistant. Her duties entailed responding to patient call bells, assisting with their daily needs of living, changing linens, and also conducting finger sticks, checking the diabetic patient's blood sugar levels.
Records indicate Reta wasn't only working in the ward during all of the incidents, she was also in the room with many of the victims.
The hospital kept sitter logs, which is just a list of when someone required one-on-one attention from a nursing assistant or sometimes a nurse. In 5 of our cases, she was sitting one-on-one with the victim immediately prior to them experiencing the hypoglycemic events.
Investigators also find evidence that Reta seemed very interested in the blood sugar levels of her patients.
So the hospital had glucometers, which is just an instrument that will measure blood glucose levels. Nursing staff, as well as nursing assistants, use the glucometers. They're required to log in.
We quickly determined that Reta Mays took a disproportionate amount of these severely low blood sugar readings as opposed to other staff.
As investigators keep digging, the glucometer readings reveal something else.
We were looking at the audit trails. Our investigative team was able to identify an additional patient who suffered similar low blood sugar readings.
Robert Edge was admitted with a UTI in July of 2017. Nothing to do with blood sugar.
My grandfather joined the Navy right out of high school to make sure that he was able to provide for himself, but also for my grandmother to be able to provide for a family in the future. When he was admitted in the hospital, my dad had texted me and was like, we're just gonna get this situation under control and then he'll just come back home.
He was diabetic, but he was not receiving insulin from the hospital. It was not on his charts at all for requiring that. And his blood sugars at one point prior to his death were measured at 17, which is extremely low.
Robert Edge Sr. died within 24 hours of his hypoglycemic event, making him the 7th veteran to pass away under suspicious circumstances.
When my grandpa passed away, there was no additional explanation given to us as to why just that blood sugar issue caused him to pass away. We didn't have my grandpa anymore. I think that it's kind of a wound that's never really healed on our side.
Agents confirm Reta Mays was the nurse's assistant on duty.
And so, really quickly into the investigation, within the first week, the investigators already had a person of interest, Reta Mays.
Agents look into Rita's background in an effort to see if there's anything that might tie her to the victims.
Reta Mays at the time was in her late 40s. She was from Clarksburg, and her family had moved around the mid-Atlantic. She did try to get a college degree in accounting, but didn't make it all the way through. She ended up marrying, having 2 sons.
Her home life was not the best. One of her sons had apparently been in jail.
We learned that her husband, Gordon Mays, was actually currently serving a 6-year sentence stemming from a conviction for child pornography.
Rita's personal life is troubling, but it's her employment history that catches investigators' attention.
One of the first things that stuck out was Reta Mays herself is a veteran.
Reta Mays served in the Army National Guard from 2001 to 2004 and even deployed as a chemical munitions repairman in support of the war in Iraq.
She was ultimately honorably discharged in 2006, and she herself received her care from the VA hospital in Clarksburg.
Prior to joining VA Medical Center in Clarksburg, she was actually a corrections officer at a local jail in West Virginia.
We learned that she left that position during an internal affairs investigation into allegations of excessive use of force.
She had been accused in several complaints of being excessively harsh and holding prisoners, while another guard was alleged to have kicked a prisoner.
That obviously set off a red flag.
When investigators talk to Rita's hospital colleagues, they find it hard to believe she could commit murder.
We learned that Reta Mays had a very stellar reputation at the medical center. She had even received a Nursing Assistant of the Year award.
But some colleagues do recall suspicious behavior.
They thought it was unusual that Reta was often found in the room with the victims, holding their hands, asking questions as to why and how this could have happened while they were suffering from the hypoglycemic events.
It furthered the investigative team's stance that we were on the right track and that Reta was our primary target.
Reta is suspected in the deaths of 7 patients. But less than a week into the investigation, another is added to the list with the death of Russell Posey Sr.
My sister got a call, it's about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning on July the 3rd, that my father had passed in the night. In the medical report, it said natural causes.
Unfortunately, there's not yet enough evidence to charge Reta.
There's a big difference between us knowing that she did this in our gut and being able to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Even worse, the hospital doesn't have any legal reason to fire Reta.
We needed to move her off the floor and not give her access to any of their patients.
Coming up, investigators confront a potential serial killer.
Did you have anything to do with these patients? I don't know what they think could have happened.
But when a suspect refuses to talk, there is only one way to reveal the buried truth.
The bodies needed to be exhumed.
Investigators suspect nurse's assistant Reta Mays has killed 8 patients by injecting them with insulin. But until they can prove she's a murderer, they need to make sure Reta doesn't harm anyone else.
Our mentality was, now that it's on our watch, we cannot let this happen to any other veterans.
We ultimately made a recommendation to the facility to remove her from patient care.
She was reassigned to the mailroom in a non-patient care capacity.
The thinking became, we need to really get to the psychology of this person. What could she be motivated by?
There were a lot of things going on in her personal life. There was a lot of turmoil, and she was losing control from a lot of different fronts.
Because she had been deployed, PTSD can sometimes play a role, and that was something that we considered.
To ensure they are ready to confront Reta with their findings, agents spend the next few weeks bolstering their case.
Electronic evidence ended up being pretty important. So we also obtained some records by search warrant, and it showed us that Reta Mays had been watching a show called Nurses Who Kill. Now look, we're not saying because you watch a show, Nurses Who Kill, that you might be a nurse who kills. But, in fact, on a couple of those episodes, insulin was the weapon of choice.
Armed with more evidence, investigators set up a meeting with Reta.
We elected to go with a specialist from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to conduct an interview with Reta.
It was a voluntary interview and lasted approximately 5.5 hours.
This interview was really meant to start introducing some of the evidence and see if she would discuss with us anything more.
As you know, we're looking into things at the hospital, issues. We're also looking into the patient deaths. And what I'm trying to accomplish today is figure out what we're missing. Okay.
After the FBI agent builds rapport with Reta, the questions become more pointed.
Did you have anything to do with the deaths or incidents with these patients? Absolutely not.
While you guys have been asking these questions about people with low blood sugar, I don't know what they think could have happened. I test the sugar, I tell the nurses what the sugar is. I know it's something to do with that, but I don't know what could have been done.
As soon as victims are brought up and the pointed questions about anything that might have happened, she really starts to shut down, and that's how she ends the interview.
I think before you're accusing me of, from here on out, I need a lawyer. Stop talking to me.
So there was no question that when she left that interview, that she knew she was our prime suspect.
Investigators see only one way to proceed, and it won't be pleasant.
Unfortunately, the investigative team had to make the difficult decision of approaching the family members of our identified victims to seek their consent to exhume their remains and perform forensic autopsies.
We're looking for every type of medical evidence to determine whether there's insulin present.
It's been 2 months since the federal investigation began, but this is the first time any of the victims' families have been told what's going on.
It was towards the end of August. FBI come to my house. I was in total shock with it. When they explained that they felt somebody had helped us along and had been giving them insulin.
What they said is, we're investigating your father's death, and we would like to exhume his body. I said, my father would want to make sure that this never happened to anybody else. And if we can help, I'm in favor of them exhuming the body.
What hurt me was they were going to disrupt his rest. But then, how much of a peaceful rest could he get without knowing the truth? So it was easy to say yes.
The families of the 8 victims give consent, and in fall 2018, investigators exhume those bodies for autopsies.
There was potential not only to look for the administration of exogenous insulin in various bodily fluid, but tissue samples that were taken to determine if insulin had been injected into the patients.
Despite months of decomposition, the medical examiner finds the evidence investigators are looking for.
The medical examiner discovered what he believed to be insulin injection sites, ultimately determined that these were homicides caused by nefarious insulin injections.
What really hit us smack in the face is seeing the autopsy report and in big, black, bold letters, the words, homicide. It just all became real then.
7 of the 8 victims' causes of death are now classified as homicide.
There remained one case that was not able to reach that opinion and left it as undetermined, and that was Mr. Posey.
Because he lived so long, approximately two weeks or more after his hypoglycemic event, the medical examiner was unable to definitively say that the insulin injection caused his death.
On the autopsy, they changed it to suspicious death and undetermined causes, which allowed them to go after her for attempted murder.
As the victims are buried for a second time, investigators confront Reta with their findings.
The investigative team made the decision to reveal to her why, at this juncture, we knew it was her and only her who had committed these acts.
What would you say if you were the prosecutor?
With everything that you're showing me, it looks like I did it.
Even under more pressure, Reta still refuses to confess.
Ultimately, after being presented with all the evidence, Reta ended the interview, got up, and left. She had had enough, and that was it.
I'm going for it. Okay.
We were at a stage where we believed we had enough evidence, and so at that point, I issued her a target letter that was served on her by the FBI. That target letter simply says, you're a target of an investigation. So she was appointed 3 attorneys. That's because it's a death penalty eligible case and she has that right. And so we start a dialogue and we are laying out all the evidence against Reta Mays.
After a 2-year investigation, authorities are certain 45-year-old nursing assistant Reta Mays is responsible for the murders of 7 patients at a veterans hospital in West Virginia. But the case never makes it to trial.
She voluntarily surrendered.
She was never arrested. She seems to be moving forward in good faith based on conversations with her attorney toward a plea agreement.
Her attorneys got what we call a reverse proffer, which is pretty much a layout of the case that would be presented against their client. And at that point, they started working out a plea deal.
Talking to the families, we learned very quickly that they're on board with a plea agreement that would put Reta Mays in prison for life.
The reason for us accepting the plea deal was so this would not get drawn out any longer than it had to be.
Part of the plea agreements were that Reta would admit to second-degree murder. So we had 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder in Mr. Posey's case.
The court sentenced Reta Mays to the maximum allowed by law, which here was 7 terms of life imprisonment and 20 years for that assault with intent to commit murder. Reta Mays will spend the rest of her life behind bars.
During sentencing, the judge calls Reta the monster no one sees coming. The only question remaining is why.
What was the motive for Reta Mays to kill elderly, helpless veterans who had been admitted to a hospital at their most vulnerable stage of life?
The plea agreement, very importantly, required that Reta Mays give a debrief in this case, where we'd have the chance finally to get answers from her for what her motivations were. She gave two contradictory reasons. One is she did try to claim to some extent that some of these were mercy killings, that they were suffering and needed to die. But the evidence didn't support that.
These veterans were not on death's door at all when they were admitted to the Clarksburg VA.
What insulin does is shut your body down, one organ at a time. And my father lived for 2 weeks. 2 weeks he suffered. That's no angel of mercy to me. That's a monster.
The other contradictory reason was that her home life was out of control. She said that in 2017, when she started having these thoughts, her husband was in prison, her son was having issues. This somehow was meant to give her a sense of control. But she told us this did not relieve her stress. And she, in fact, hoped that she would get caught someday. While the things she told us were interesting, we'll never know why Reta Mays committed these heinous acts.
Why did Reta snap? I have no idea. I have no idea why she went to the dark side and started playing God.
Reta Mays might be etched in the annals of American serial killers, but the names of the men whose lives she stole, Robert Edge Sr., Robert Kozel, Archie Edgell, George Shaw Sr., W.A.H., Felix McDermott, Raymond Golden, and Russell Posey Sr. will be memorialized for a better reason.
They should be remembered as men who honorably served our country, who were loved and loved their families, and deserved a lot better.
I think their legacy will be helping improve how people are treated in the VA, proving in a system that they all, I think, believed in.
They were respectable men. They had loving families. Their families will make sure that they are never forgotten. Never forgotten.
The call came in just before sunrise, the kind of hour when the world is quiet enough to hear something you're not supposed to hear. A voice on the line, thin, trembling, caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. The dispatcher asked the question twice before getting a clear answer. Something in the water. Something that didn't belong there. A shape that didn't move. By the time the first patrol unit reached the canal, the fog still clung low across the surface, dense and stubborn, swallowing distance, muting sound. Florida humidity pressed down like a weight, thick, suffocating, wrapping around the scene before anyone even stepped out of the car. The officer approached slowly, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil along the bank, eyes adjusting to the pale gray light bleeding through the mist. At first, it didn't look real. A form caught in the reeds, half hidden, half exposed, as if the water itself was trying to keep a secret and failing. Then the outline sharpened. A shoulder. An arm. Hair drifting slightly with the current. No movement. No sound. Just stillness. He called it in. Voice controlled, but tighter now. Backup requested. Possible body. Within minutes, the quiet broke. Sirens cut through the fog. More units arrived. Tape went up. Radios crackled. The slow, methodical choreography of a crime scene began to unfold. Detectives stepped in with measured precision, scanning everything, touching nothing, reading the ground like it might speak if they listened closely enough. They pulled her out carefully. Female, mid to late 20s, maybe early 30s. Hard to be certain. The water had already begun to blur the details, softening edges, distorting time. But not everything was erased. Not the bruising around the neck. Not the faint discoloration along the arms. Not the unnatural stillness that spoke louder than any wound.
No identification. No bag. No shoes.
Just a body with no name. By mid-morning, the sun had burned through the fog, exposing the scene fully, stripping away whatever illusion the mist had offered. News began to spread. A body found in the canal. A woman, possibly murdered. The words moved fast, jumping from house to house, across phone lines, through conversations that grew quieter as they went on. The sheriff stood in front of a small cluster of cameras that afternoon, expression steady, voice carefully measured. "We are investigating this as a suspicious death." The phrase landed softly, but it carried weight. Suspicious meant uncertainty to the public. To the people behind the tape, it meant something else entirely. They already knew. The autopsy removed any doubt. Cause of death: strangulation. Not accidental. Not ambiguous. Direct force. Close contact. Personal. Whoever had done this hadn't just ended a life. They had been close enough to feel it happen. And yet, the evidence refused to cooperate. No signs of prolonged struggle. No defensive wounds strong enough to suggest a fight for survival. No clear fibers.
No identifiable prints. No weapon.
Nothing that pointed cleanly in one direction. It was as if the act itself had been deliberate, controlled, executed with a calm that didn't belong in a moment like that. They began building the timeline. Time of death estimated within 24 hours before discovery. That narrowed the window, but not enough. She hadn't been in the water long, which meant she had been killed recently.
Nearby.
The body hadn't traveled far. This wasn't a disposal site chosen at random from miles away. This was local. So they worked outward.
Door to door.
Street to street. Questions repeated so many times they began to sound mechanical.
Did you see anything?
Hear anything? Anyone unfamiliar? Most answers were the same.
No.
Nothing. Just another quiet night. But quiet nights have gaps. A man mentioned hearing a car late, engine idling longer than usual. A woman thought she heard voices, maybe raised, maybe not. Another recalled headlights cutting across her window sometime after midnight. Fragments. Pieces that refused to lock together. Then came the diner. 2 miles from the canal. Open late. The kind of place where people pass through without being noticed, unless something about them stands out. The waitress remembered her immediately. She said the woman came in alone, just before midnight. Sat near the end of the counter. Ordered coffee but barely touched it. Hands restless. Eyes scanning the room like she was expecting someone or avoiding someone. Dark hair. Light-colored dress.
No jacket. No purse. No purse.
That detail lingered longer than the rest. People carry things. IDs, keys, something that ties them to a place, a life. But this woman had nothing.
No wallet. No bag.
No trace of identity. She paid in cash. Exact change. Left quickly. No one saw where she went. The detectives pulled every record they could find. Credit cards, nothing. Missing persons, no immediate match. Nearby motels were checked. Guest lists reviewed. Faces questioned. Names cross-referenced. It all circled back to the same point.
She didn't exist.
Or at least not in any way that was easy to find. Days turned into weeks. The initial urgency faded into a slower, heavier persistence. The file grew thicker, reports, statements, photographs, but the core remained empty. No name.
No suspect.
No clear direction. The media began to shift tone. What started as breaking news became a lingering question. Then a quiet headline. Then a phrase that investigators hate hearing. Cold case. It wasn't official yet, but the trajectory was clear. Without identification, everything stalls. No background.
No relationships.
No known movements. Just a moment of violence disconnected from everything that came before it. They ran fingerprints again and again, expanded searches beyond state lines, checked national databases. Nothing. Dental records offered no help. DNA was collected, preserved, but at the time, there was nowhere meaningful to run it. Technology had limits. Time didn't. Months passed, then a year. The case moved from active to inactive, a subtle shift that carries weight inside a department. It doesn't mean forgotten. It means waiting. Waiting for something new, something unexpected, something that might never come. The town adjusted. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough to continue. People still mentioned it occasionally. The woman in the canal, the one with no name. It became part of the local memory, a story told in fragments, always ending the same way. No one knows what happened, but someone always does. That truth sat quietly beneath everything. Because cases like this don't disappear. They settle. They wait. And the person responsible doesn't vanish. They keep living, moving through days, years, decades, carrying something no one else can see. Somewhere, there was a person who knew exactly what happened that night. And they said nothing. The file was boxed eventually, stored with others like it, shelved in a room where time moves differently. Dust collects, labels fade, but the contents remain exactly as they were left, frozen in the moment the investigation stalled. Florida, 1998. Unidentified female. Homicide. Waiting. Years rolled forward. The world outside changed. Technology advanced. Systems expanded. Methods evolved. Cases once thought impossible began to crack open under new approaches, new tools, new ways of looking at old evidence. Names were being restored to the nameless. Patterns were being uncovered where none had been seen before. And slowly, quietly, attention began to return to the files that had been left behind. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a shift, a reassessment, a second look. Because sometimes the answer isn't new. It's just been waiting for the right moment to be seen. And somewhere in that storage room, among rows of sealed evidence and forgotten reports, the case of the woman in the canal remained untouched, unchanged, unresolved. Until the day someone opened the box again. And everything that had been silent for decades began, very slowly, to speak. The box hadn't been opened in years. Dust had settled into its edges, fine and undisturbed, as if time itself had sealed it shut. The label was still there, faded but legible. Florida, 1998. Unidentified female. Homicide. A case that had slipped out of the present and into storage, waiting in that quiet space where unanswered questions go when no one knows what to do with them anymore. Until someone decided to look again. The detective assigned to cold cases didn't expect anything dramatic. Most reviews end the same way they begin, routine, methodical, uneventful. Old files rarely give up new secrets, but procedure demanded it. Every piece of evidence rechecked, every report reread, every assumption questioned. Because time changes things. Not the past, not what happened, but how it can be understood. He laid everything out carefully. Photographs first, the canal, the reeds, the body as it was found, then the autopsy images. Clinical, detached. The kind of documentation that removes emotions so facts can stand on their own. Bruising patterns, pressure points. The marks that told the same story they had told decades earlier. Strangulation, controlled, intentional. Then came the reports, witness statements, the diner waitress, the fragments of sound in the night, the car that may or may not have been there, the absence of identity, the silence that followed. Nothing new. But then he reached the evidence logs. Sealed items, cataloged, preserved. Some tested, some not. Back in 1998, limitations weren't just technical, they were procedural. Certain samples were collected because they could be, not because anyone knew exactly what to do with them yet. One entry stood out. A biological sample, partial, degraded, but intact enough to store. At the time, it hadn't yielded anything useful. No match in any system available then. No suspect to compare it to. So it had been archived like everything else. Forgotten, but not lost. He stared at the entry longer than necessary. Because now, decades later, that same kind of sample could mean something very different. He requested it. The lab technicians handled it with the same care they would give to any fresh piece of evidence. Age didn't diminish its value. If anything, it increased it, because it represented a chance, one that hadn't existed before. Extraction took time. Preparation took longer. The process was meticulous, precise, unforgiving. Any mistake could destroy what little remained. Days passed. Then the profile came back. Partial, but usable. That was enough. They ran it through modern databases first. CODIs, state systems, national systems. The same channels that had failed the case years ago, but now with expanded data, more entries, more possibilities. No direct hit. Not surprising. But this wasn't where the real shift had happened. The detective authorized the next step. A path that hadn't existed in 1998. A path that had already begun to reshape how cold cases were solved across the country. Genetic genealogy. The sample was processed differently this time. Not just for law enforcement comparison, but for broader analysis. Patterns, markers, connections that extended beyond criminal databases into familial lines. It wasn't about finding the person. It was about finding someone connected to them. Distant relatives. Shared DNA. Fragments of identity scattered across generations. The results didn't come quickly. Weeks turned into months. The waiting was familiar, but different now. Because this time, there was movement beneath the surface. Analysts building family trees. Cross-referencing public records. Following lines that branched outward, then inward, narrowing slowly. Then, finally, something solid. A match, not direct, but close enough. Second cousins, maybe third, enough to begin constructing a network. Names started appearing. Locations, dates, histories. And within that expanding web, one line stood out. A woman reported missing in late 1997. Not in Florida. Hundreds of miles away. The report was old, nearly as old as the body in the canal. Filed, investigated briefly, then left unresolved when no evidence pointed forward. The trail had gone cold long before the canal case was ever discovered. 2 separate cases. 2 separate jurisdictions. No known connection.
Until now.
The detective pulled the file. Different department, different state, different investigators. But the details aligned in ways that were impossible to ignore. Age range, physical description,
timeline,
the gap between disappearance and discovery. It wasn't confirmation. Not yet. But it was enough to act. They contacted the family. Carefully, slowly, because after decades, the past doesn't just reopen, it fractures. Hope, grief, uncertainty, all tangled together. The kind of call that changes everything again, even after so much time has passed. The family had lived with absence for years. Questions without answers. A missing person who had never come home, never been found, never been explained. Until now, possibly. They provided what they could. Old records, personal details, DNA for comparison. And then the waiting started again. But this time, it felt different. Because now, the case wasn't just about a body in a canal. It was about a life that had been interrupted, a name that might finally be restored, a connection that bridged decades of silence. When the confirmation came, it was quiet.
No headlines, no cameras.
Just a report. The unidentified woman from Florida, 1998, had a name. And with that name came everything that had been missing.
A past.
A family. A last known location. People who had seen her alive, spoken to her, known who she was before she became a mystery. But it also brought something else. A new set of questions. Because now the timeline could be traced more clearly. She had left her home state days before she was found. No clear reason. No confirmed destination. Just movement. Travel that didn't fit any established pattern in her life. Why Florida? Why that town? Why that canal? The diner sighting suddenly carried more weight. She wasn't local. She didn't belong there. She was passing through or trying to. And she was afraid. That detail sharpened everything. People don't cross state lines and end up alone, nervous, without belongings, unless something has already gone wrong. Or is about to. The investigation shifted again. This wasn't just about identifying a victim anymore. It was about retracing her final hours. Who she met.
Who she trusted.
Who she tried to avoid. And somewhere in that narrow window of time, between the diner and the canal, something had happened. Something controlled. Intentional.
Close.
The kind of act that leaves no room for chance. And somewhere, still out there, was the person who had been there with her. Close enough to take her life. Close enough to leave without being seen. Close enough to believe they had gotten away with it. For decades.
Until now.
Because the silence was breaking. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. A name changes everything. For years, she had been a silhouette, Jane Doe, a body without a past, a life reduced to evidence markers and autopsy reports. Now she was someone real again. A daughter, a sister, a person who had once existed in a world far away from the canal where her story ended. And with that name came a timeline. The last confirmed sighting before Florida was hundreds of miles north. A small town. Quiet. Predictable. The kind of place where people notice when something is off, when routines break, when someone leaves without saying exactly where they're going. She had told people she needed time. A trip. Nothing unusual on the surface. No signs of panic, no open fear. But there were gaps, small inconsistencies that didn't mean much back then, details that only stand out when you know how the story ends. She packed light. Too light.
No lagi.
Just a few items. Enough for a short trip, not a disappearance. No clear destination. No return date firmly set. Just the suggestion that she would be back soon. She never came back. The investigation began to stretch across state lines, pulling in records that hadn't been connected before. Gas station receipts, toll logs, fragments of movement traced through time, each one incomplete on its own, but together forming a rough path south. She had driven, alone. At least at first. That mattered. Because it meant control. It meant choice. She wasn't forced into the journey. She started it willingly, which raised the question that now sat at the center of everything. What changed? Somewhere along that route, something shifted. Something that turned a simple trip into a fatal ending in a canal hundreds of miles away. The detectives began reconstructing her last known movements hour by hour. It wasn't precise, but it was enough to build a pattern. Stops along the highway, a purchase late in the evening, then a gap, a stretch of time where she disappeared from every record. Until the diner. That moment, once just a vague lead, now became critical. They returned to it with new eyes. The waitress was older now, but memory has a way of holding on to certain details, especially when they're tied to something that never made sense. She remembered the woman more clearly now that she had a face to match the memory. The nervous energy. The way her hands moved constantly, as if she couldn't keep them still. The way she kept checking the door. Not waiting. Watching. The difference mattered. Waiting suggests expectation. Watching suggests fear. They asked about anything else. Anyone who came in around the same time. Anyone who might have noticed her. There was hesitation. Then something surfaced.
A man.
Not someone she knew. Not a regular. Just someone who had come in shortly after the woman. Sat a few stools away. Didn't speak to her, at least not openly. But he watched her. The same way she watched the door. The waitress hadn't thought much of it at the time. People come and go. Strangers sit near each other without interaction. It happens every night. But now, placed against everything else, it felt different. They worked to build a description.
Male.
Late 30s to early 40s, maybe. Average height. Nothing particularly striking. The kind of face that doesn't stay in memory easily. The kind of presence that blends in. That detail, more than anything else, unsettled the investigators. Because the most dangerous people are often the ones you don't notice. No name. No vehicle description. No record of him paying with anything traceable. Just a presence. A shadow that might mean everything or nothing. They expanded outward again. Traffic cameras were limited in 1998. Surveillance was inconsistent, fragmented. But some businesses kept tapes. Old recordings stored away, rarely reviewed, often overwritten. Most were gone. But not all. A gas station less than a mile from the diner had archived footage from that week. Not intentionally preserved, just forgotten in storage when systems were upgraded years later. The quality was poor, grainy, time stamps flickering, but it was something. They watched it frame by frame.
Cars pulling in.
Fuel pumps. People moving in and out of the small store. Nothing remarkable at first. Then a match. Her car. Confirmed through registration records tied to her name. The same make, the same model, the same plate. She had stopped there shortly before reaching the diner. She stepped out of the vehicle.
Alone.
She looked different from how the waitress described her, but only slightly. More composed. Less visibly anxious. But there was still something in the way she moved.
Quick.
Focused. Like she didn't want to stay longer than necessary. She went inside. The camera didn't capture the interior clearly. Just shadows moving behind the glass. Then she came back out. And this time, she wasn't alone. The footage caught only a partial view. A figure behind her.
Male.
Same general build as the description from the diner. He didn't walk beside her. He followed just a step or two back. Close enough to be connected. Distant enough to avoid immediate attention. They reached her car. There was a moment, brief, almost unnoticeable, where she hesitated. A pause before opening the door. A glance that lasted less than a second.
Toward him.
Then she got in.
He didn't.
He stayed outside, leaning slightly toward the driver's side window. Speaking. The audio was gone, lost to time, but the body language was there. Conversation. Short. Controlled. Then he stepped back. She drove away. He remained. Watching the car disappear. That moment became the pivot point. Because now, for the first time, there was visual confirmation. She had not been entirely alone. They enhanced the footage as much as possible.
Cleaned it.
Stabilized it. Tried to pull details from shadows that weren't meant to give anything away. A partial face. The outline of clothing. A posture that could be compared, measured, analyzed. But it was still incomplete. Enough to suggest. Not enough to identify. They circulated still images internally, cross-referenced with known offenders in the area at the time, checked records of arrests, reports, anyone who matched even loosely. Nothing definitive. But the focus had shifted. The investigation was no longer searching in all directions. It had narrowed to a window of time, a specific location, a single interaction that might have been the last normal moment before everything went wrong. From the gas station to the diner. From the diner to the canal. A stretch of hours where the answers had to exist. Somewhere in that sequence, the man from the footage crossed from observer to participant, from stranger to suspect. And if he had been close enough to speak to her, close enough to follow her, close enough to stand at her window in the dark, then he had been close enough to do much more. The silence that had protected him for decades was beginning to fracture. And every fragment that surfaced made the picture clearer. He had been there. He had seen her alive. And now, for the first time, there was a path leading directly toward him. The footage changed the weight of the case. For years, everything had been abstract, assumptions, probabilities, fragments that never fully connected. Now there was a shape, a presence captured in time. Not clear enough to identify, but real enough to confirm what had only been suspected. She wasn't alone. And more importantly, she hadn't been alone just before she died. Investigators leaned into that narrow window with intensity that hadn't existed in decades. Every minute between the gas station and the canal became critical. Every possible route mapped. Every intersection revisited, as if it might still hold a memory from that night. The distance wasn't far. Less than 10 minutes by car. A short drive. A contained space. A controlled environment where something had shifted, escalated, and ended. They began with the vehicle. Her car had never been found. That fact, once buried under the larger mystery, now surfaced with sharp clarity. A missing vehicle meant movement after the crime. It meant the killer had time, access, and enough composure to remove a major piece of evidence without being detected, which narrowed the profile. This wasn't random chaos. It wasn't a sudden explosion of violence followed by panic. The absence of the car suggested planning, or, at least experience. The ability to think beyond the moment, to consider what would be left behind. They pulled old records again. Stolen vehicle reports, abandoned cars, impounds that might have gone unnoticed. The list was long, but time had thinned it. Many records incomplete. Some lost, others buried under years of unrelated data. Still, patterns began to emerge. Within days of her death, a vehicle matching her car's description had been reported abandoned in a neighboring county. Not flagged as suspicious at the time. Just another car left on the side of a road.
Towed. Logged.
Eventually processed, without deeper investigation. The location mattered. It wasn't random. It was positioned just off a secondary highway, far enough from the canal to disconnect it from the scene, but close enough to be reached quickly. A place where someone could leave a vehicle and disappear without drawing attention. They tracked the records further. The impound report still existed. Sparse, but intact. The car had been held briefly, then released through standard procedures. No evidence collected. No connection made. Because at the time there was no reason to connect it. Now it was everything. The vehicle had changed hands after being processed.
Sold.
Transferred. Lost again in the flow of ownership over decades. Tracking it down would be difficult, maybe impossible. But even without the physical car, the path it took after abandonment told a story. The killer had driven it. That much was certain. From the canal to the drop point. A short distance, a calculated move, enough to separate the body from the vehicle, to create distance, to disrupt the timeline. And then he left.
On foot?
Unlikely. Which meant another vehicle, another layer, another unknown. They returned to the gas station footage again, this time focusing not just on the interaction but on everything around it, every car in the frame. Every arrival and departure within that time window. One vehicle stood out. A dark sedan. It entered the frame shortly before she did, parked near the edge of the lot, partially obscured from the main camera angle. The driver remained inside for several minutes before stepping out. The timing aligned. The figure exiting the sedan matched the general build of the man seen approaching her. After she left, the same sedan remained for a short period, then pulled away. Direction, south. Toward the canal. The connection wasn't proven, but it was strong. They enhanced the footage again, isolating the vehicle. License plate unreadable. Too grainy. Too distant. But the make and model could be approximated. Common enough to avoid immediate identification, rare enough to narrow the field slightly. They compiled a list. Registered vehicles matching the description within a defined radius in 1998. Thousands at first. Then filtered by ownership changes, criminal records, proximity to the area at the time. The list shrank. Still large. Still overwhelming. But no longer infinite. They began cross-referencing names against everything else in the case. Individuals with histories of violence. Prior arrests involving assault. Patterns that suggested escalation. People who had passed through the region without leaving much behind. One name surfaced repeatedly. Not because it stood out immediately, but because it didn't. A man who had lived in the area briefly in the late 90s. No long-term ties. No strong community presence. Employment records inconsistent. Address changes frequent. The kind of background that doesn't draw attention unless someone is specifically looking for it. He owned a vehicle similar to the one in the footage. Registered within a reasonable distance of the gas station at the time. No major criminal record. But minor incidents. Disturbances. Complaints. Nothing that escalated to serious charges. The kind of history that sits quietly in files, unnoticed, unless something connects it to something bigger. They dug deeper. Old reports. Interviews. Anything that mentioned his name. Most were insignificant. Routine. Forgettable. But patterns began to form when viewed together. Control. Anger. Situations where confrontation didn't lead to immediate violence, but carried tension just beneath the surface. Statements from neighbors, coworkers, people who had interacted with him briefly and moved on. He kept to himself. Something about him felt off. He watched more than he talked. Not evidence, but context. They tracked his movements after 1998. He had left the area not long after the estimated time of the crime. Relocated. Changed jobs. Changed states. No clear reason. Just movement. The same pattern the victim had followed. But his ended differently. He kept going. He built a life. Or, at least, something that looked like one from the outside. The timeline tightened further. Presence in the area at the right time. A vehicle that could match the footage. A behavioral pattern that aligned with control and proximity-based violence. And then one more detail. A report from years later, in another state. An incident involving him and a woman. Not fatal, but close. The description of the confrontation carried echoes of something familiar. The same tension. The same shift from calm to controlled aggression. The same need to dominate the moment. It had been dismissed at the time. No lasting injuries. No charges that held. But now, placed against the Florida case, it felt different. Like a continuation. Or a glimpse into something that had already happened before. The investigators didn't move immediately. They couldn't. Suspicion isn't proof. Patterns aren't evidence. But they had something now that didn't exist before. Direction. The case was no longer drifting through decades of uncertainty. It was moving toward a specific person, a specific past, a specific night that had been hidden under layers of silence. And somewhere within all the records, the movements, the fragments of behavior and timing, there was a moment where everything aligned, where the man from the footage, the driver of the sedan, the one who watched and followed and waited, stopped being a shadow and became real. The silence was thinning, and the closer they got, the more dangerous that silence became. Because when a case like this begins to close in, it doesn't just uncover the truth. It corners it. The name didn't look dangerous on paper. It never does. Typed in black ink across aging records, buried among hundreds of others, it carried no immediate weight. No headline history. No violent flag that would force anyone to stop and look twice. Just a man who existed, moved, worked, disappeared into the background of every place he passed through. That was the first thing that made investigators uneasy. Because the absence of noise isn't the same as the absence of danger. They built his timeline slowly, piece by piece, reconstructing a life that had never drawn attention. Employment records showed short-term jobs, warehouse work, maintenance, delivery routes. Nothing stable, nothing long enough to establish deep connections. He arrived, stayed just long enough to be recognized, then left. Addresses followed the same pattern. Rentals, temporary housing, shared spaces, places where neighbors come and go, where questions aren't asked, where silence is normal. But the dates mattered. He had been in Florida in 1998. Not just passing through. Living close enough to the canal to know it existed. Close enough to understand the layout of the roads, the quieter routes, the places where visibility dropped off at night. That knowledge wasn't random. It was local. They overlaid his address history with a known timeline of the victim's last movements. The gas station, the diner, the canal, the abandoned vehicle site. Each point fell within reach. Not just geographically. Practically. The kind of distances that could be traveled quickly, confidently, without hesitation. They returned to the footage again, this time with him in mind. Height estimates, body proportions, gait analysis. Small details that are easy to miss until you're looking for them. The way the man in the video shifted his weight, the angle of his shoulders, the way he stood slightly back when speaking through the car window. Subtle. But consistent. It wasn't confirmation. But it wasn't coincidence either. They needed more. Because cases don't close on instincts. They close on evidence. So they turned to what had changed the most since 1998. DNA. The sample recovered from the victim all those years ago had already been processed through modern systems. It had led them to her identity. It had opened the case again. Now it needed to do something more. It needed to point directly at him. But there was a problem. They didn't have his DNA. Not officially. No arrests that required collection. No records in national databases. No medical samples accessible through legal channels. Which meant they had to get it another way. Surveillance began quietly. No public movement. No sudden contact. Just observation. Confirmation of location. Routine tracking to establish patterns. Where he lived now. Where he worked. Who he interacted with. Decades had passed. He was older. But not unrecognizable. The years had added weight, softened edges, changed posture, but something remained. The same contained presence. The same controlled stillness that doesn't draw attention unless you're specifically looking for it. He had built a life. Or at least the appearance of one. A steady job now. A fixed address. Limited social circle. No obvious signs of instability. No visible connection to the past that investigators were uncovering. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest he had ever been part of something violent. That was the second thing that made them uneasy. Because people don't just become invisible. They choose it. They followed him for days. Then weeks. Watching for opportunity. Something discarded. Something left behind. An item that could be collected without alerting him. A cup. A cigarette. Anything that carried biological material. It didn't take long. Routine creates openings. One morning, he stopped at a convenience store, bought coffee, stood outside for a few minutes, drank half, then threw the cup into a public trash bin before leaving. They waited. Made sure he was gone. Then moved in. The cup was collected, sealed, logged. Chain of custody established. The process was careful, precise, deliberate, because this moment, this single piece of evidence, could determine everything that came next. The lab worked fast. Faster than in 1998. Faster than even a decade ago. Technology had caught up to cases like this. And now it was about to close the gap completely. The comparison was straightforward. The sample from the victim. The sample from the cup. 2 profiles. 1 question. Do they match? The answer didn't come immediately. But when it did, it didn't leave room for doubt. It was a match. Not partial. Not suggestive. Definitive. The kind of result that doesn't just support a theory, it confirms it. The man they had been watching, the one who had moved quietly through years without drawing attention, had been there. Close enough. Connected directly to the victim in the most critical moment of her life. The silence that had protected him for decades shattered instantly. But the investigation didn't stop there. It couldn't. Because DNA answers one question. Presence. It doesn't explain what happened. It doesn't describe the moment. It doesn't tell the story of how a woman traveled hundreds of miles and ended up dead in a canal. For that, they needed him. And getting him to speak would be something else entirely. Because men like this don't confess easily. They don't break under pressure. They survive by controlling what they reveal. And for decades, he had revealed nothing. The arrest came without warning. Controlled. Quiet.
No spectacle.
He was taken into custody at his workplace. No resistance. No attempt to run. No visible reaction beyond mild confusion. As if he had been expecting something, but not this.
Not now.
Not after all this time. They transported him without incident. Booked him. Processed him. The same system that had failed to identify him decades earlier now held him in place. The roles had reversed. He was no longer invisible. He was the center of everything. The interrogation room was small. Deliberately so. A controlled environment. Neutral colors.
No distractions.
Just a table. 2 chairs. A camera recording everything. He sat calmly. Hands folded. Eyes steady. Waiting. The detectives entered without urgency. No raised voices.
No immediate accusations.
Because the first move matters. And in a case like this, patience is the most dangerous tool. They started simple. Name. Background. Routine questions. He answered without hesitation. Cooperative. Measured. The same control that had defined him outside carried into the room. Then they shifted. 1998. Florida. The canal. The words landed softly. But the effect was immediate. Not dramatic. Not visible to anyone who wasn't trained to see it. A slight pause. A fraction longer than normal before answering. A change in breathing. Small. But real. He denied knowing anything.
Of course he did.
They expected that. Denial is the first layer. It always is. They didn't push. Not yet. They let the silence sit. Because silence forces movement. Forces thought. Forces cracks to form. And somewhere behind his calm exterior, something had already started to shift. Because for the first time in decades, he wasn't controlling the narrative anymore. And he knew it. Even if he didn't show it.
Yet.
The room held its breath.
No windows. No clocks.
Just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the soft, constant presence of a camera that missed nothing. He sat exactly where they had left him, posture unchanged, hands still folded as if they belonged there.
Calm.
measured, waiting for something he couldn't yet define. The detectives didn't rush back in. Time is pressure. Silence is pressure. And in a room like this, with nowhere to look and nowhere to go, pressure builds slowly, quietly, until it starts to bend things that seem unbreakable. When they returned, nothing about their approach changed. Same tone, same pace.
No confrontación.
Just conversation. They circled back to Florida, 1998. The area, the job he held at the time, the places he used to go. They asked questions that sounded routine, almost casual, but each one placed him deeper into the geography of the case. He answered. He remembered the town, the roads, the general layout, enough to confirm what they already knew. He had been there. He had lived within reach of the canal. Still, nothing connected him directly. Not in his words. That was expected. Because the truth wasn't going to come from what he said first. It was going to come from what he couldn't avoid. They shifted again. The gas station. A pause. Not long. But longer than before. He said he didn't remember. Said it had been too long. Said he stopped at a lot of places back then. All technically true. But truth can be shaped. And he was shaping it carefully. They let him continue. Let him build the version of himself he wanted them to see. Cooperative. Open. Harmless. A man pulled into something he didn't understand. Then they placed the still image on the table. Grainy. Faded. But recognizable enough when paired with context. The figure beside her car. The outline. The posture. The moment frozen in time. He looked at it. Longer this time. Eyes moving slightly, as if trying to find a way around it. I don't know who that is, he said.
Flat.
Controlled. But something had shifted. Because now the conversation wasn't abstract anymore. It was visual. It was anchored. They didn't challenge the denial. Not directly. Instead, they added another piece. The timeline. They walked him through it slowly. The gas station, the diner, the canal, the abandoned car, each point placed carefully, each one narrowing the space he had left to move. He listened. Said little. Watched them more than the evidence. Because men like this don't just respond, they study. They calculate. They look for weaknesses. But there weren't any. Not this time. Then they placed the final piece on the table. The report. No images.
No dramatic presentation.
Just a document.
Clean.
Clinical. Definitive. DNA match.
His.
Connected directly to the victim. The silence that followed was different. Not the controlled silence from before. This one had weight. Because there are moments when the structure a person builds around themselves begins to collapse, not all at once, but in small, irreversible fractures. He didn't speak immediately.
Didn't deny it.
Didn't explain it. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the paper, as if reading it again might change what it said. It didn't. They let the silence stretch. Because now, for the first time, he had no clean exit. No simple denial that could hold. His presence was no longer a question. It was a fact. And facts don't negotiate. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Not dramatically. But enough. I didn't kill anyone. The words came slower. Less certain. Still controlled, but thinner now, like the edges had started to wear down. They didn't argue. They didn't accuse. They just asked. Then tell us what happened. That's the pivot. The moment where denial shifts into explanation. Where a suspect tries to maintain control by offering a version of events that keeps them just outside the line of guilt. He leaned back slightly. Hands unfolding for the first time. A small movement, but significant, because control was slipping. I met her, he said. Simple.
Direct.
More than he had given before. They let him continue. She was nervous. At the gas station. I saw her inside first. Thought she might need help. Help. The word sat wrong. But they didn't interrupt. I talked to her. Asked if she was okay. She said she was just traveling. Didn't know the area. Pieces. Fragments. A story beginning to form. I followed her to the diner. Not like that. Just same direction.
Not like that.
A distinction. A defense. Already shaping the narrative. They kept their expressions neutral. No reaction. Because reaction gives direction. And right now, they needed him to keep talking. We talked again outside. She seemed scared. Said she thought someone was following her. That detail landed hard. Because it changed everything. Not just what happened, but what she had been experiencing in the hours before she died. Did she say who? One detective asked. He shook his head.
No.
Just that she didn't feel safe. The room tightened. Because now the question shifted. If she felt unsafe, why stay with him? Why continue the interaction? Unless... I offered to help, he said quickly, filling the silence. Drive with her for a bit. Make sure she got somewhere safe. The explanation came faster now. Less controlled. More urgent. Because he could feel where the conversation was going. And then, the detective asked. A pause. Longer than any before. We drove, he said finally. Just talking. The simplicity of it didn't match the reality they already knew. Not the bruising. Not the strangulation. Not the body in the canal. They waited. Because the gap between what he was saying and what they knew was widening. And gaps like that demand to be filled. I dropped her off, he added. Too quickly. Too clean. At the canal? The question cut through everything.
Direct.
Unavoidable. He didn't answer immediately. And in that hesitation, everything was there. The truth. The memory. The moment he had kept buried for decades. I didn't kill her, he repeated. But now it sounded different. Not a denial. A shield. And it was starting to crack. Because the story he was building didn't explain the evidence. Didn't explain the timeline. Didn't explain how a woman who asked for help ended up dead. And somewhere inside that silence, the next piece of the truth was waiting.
Closer now.
More dangerous. Because once it came out, there would be no way to take it back. The story didn't hold. It sat in the room, fragile, incomplete, stretched thin across facts that refused to bend around it. He kept his eyes on the table now, no longer studying the detectives, no longer measuring their reactions. The control he had carried into the room was still there, but it was fading, slipping in small, almost invisible ways. Because once a man starts explaining, he has already stepped away from denial. And explanation is where things unravel. They didn't rush him. Didn't challenge the gaps immediately. They let his version exist just long enough for him to feel its weight, for him to hear it out loud and understand how little it covered. You drove together, one of them said quietly, from the diner. He nodded. Yes. Where? A pause. Just around. She didn't know where she was going. Then why the canal? Another pause. Longer. Because now the story needed direction. We just ended up there. The answer came flat. Unconvincing even to him. They let that sit. Because randomness doesn't survive in a timeline like this. Not when the distances are short, the movements are deliberate, and the ending is as final as it was. You followed her from the gas station. The detective continued, voice steady, almost conversational. You spoke to her there. You went to the diner. You watched her. Then you left together. He didn't respond. Didn't correct it.
Didn't deny it.
And that silence mattered more than anything he had said so far. Because silence is agreement when the alternative is denial. She told you she was scared, the detective added, that someone was following her. A slight movement. A tightening around his jaw. She asked for help, the detective continued. And you gave it. He shifted in his chair. Small. But enough. And then she ended up dead. The words landed harder this time. Not louder. Just closer. More direct. He inhaled slowly. Held it. Let it out. I didn't kill her. Again. But the repetition was losing strength. Because now it wasn't standing alone. It was surrounded. By evidence. By timeline. By his own words. They leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive. Just present. Then tell us what happened between the diner and the canal. That space. Those minutes. That drive. That was where everything lived. He closed his eyes briefly. A fraction of a second. But enough to show something internal shifting. Memory. Pressure. Something he had kept locked down for years beginning to move.
She got in the car, he said.
Yours. A nod. Yes. Why? She didn't want to be alone. The answer came faster. More natural. Because parts of this were true. That's how stories like this are built. Truth wrapped around something else. We drove.
She talked.
Said she thought someone had been watching her since earlier that day. Where? I don't know. She didn't say. Convenient. But possible. They let it pass. For how long? Not long. Maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes. The exact distance between the diner and the canal. The exact window they had been building toward. And then he hesitated again. This time longer. Because this was the point where the story either aligned or broke completely. She wanted to get out. The words came quieter. Different. She said she didn't trust me. That detail shifted everything. Because it introduced conflict. Tension. A reason for something to change. What did you do? The detective asked. I stopped. Where? He swallowed. At the canal. Of course. Because that was the only place left. They let the silence stretch again. Because now they were standing at the edge of the moment. The one that had been hidden for decades. She got out, the detective asked. A nod. Yes. And then you left. Another pause. But this one carried weight. Because now the lie had to cover the evidence. I waited a second, he said. For what? I don't know. Just making sure she was okay. The explanation felt forced.
Thin.
Because nothing about what followed suggested concern. Then I left. The room went still. Because now everything had been said. And nothing matched. Not the DNA. Not the cause of death. Not the fact that she never left that canal alive. You expect us to believe that? the detective asked quietly.
No anger.
No raised voice. Just a question that cut through everything. He didn't answer. Didn't look up. Because there wasn't an answer that could fix it. They leaned back slightly. Changed the angle. Because sometimes pressure isn't about pushing harder. It's about shifting direction. She told you she was scared, the detective said again. She gets into her car anyway. Drives with you.
Talks to you.
Then suddenly she doesn't trust you anymore. A pause. Something happened in that car. Silence. You didn't just stop and let her walk away. Silence again. You were the last person to see her alive. His hands tightened slightly. Fingers pressing together. A small sign. But clear. You were there when she died. The words didn't come with force. They didn't need to. Because the truth was already in the room. And he could feel it closing in. I didn't kill her, he said again. But this time, it sounded different. Not like a statement. Like a boundary. One he was trying to hold. One that was starting to collapse. Because every version he offered left one question unanswered. If he didn't kill her, then who did? There was no one else in the timeline. No second vehicle. No second person. No evidence of anyone else entering that space. Just him. And her. And the canal. The detectives let that question sit without asking it directly. Because sometimes the most powerful question is the one that isn't spoken. The one that forms on its own. Inside the silence. Inside the pressure. Inside the mind of the person trying to avoid it. He shifted again. Looked up briefly. Then away. Because now he could feel it. The narrowing. The inevitability. The fact that the space he had been using to hide for decades
was gone.
And the next thing he said would matter more than everything that came before it. Because there were only two directions left. Continue the lie, or step into the truth. And the truth was waiting. Right there. In the space between them. Unmoving. Unavoidable. And getting closer with every second he stayed silent. Silence doesn't stay empty forever. It fills. With pressure. With memory. With the weight of everything that hasn't been said. He sat there, eyes fixed somewhere between the edge of the table and the space just beyond it, as if looking directly at the truth would make it harder to keep buried. His hands were no longer still. Small movements now, fingers shifting, pressing, releasing, subtle, but constant. The control was slipping.
Not in a dramatic way.
Not yet. But enough. The detectives didn't interrupt it. They let the silence do the work. Because once the mind starts replaying something it has avoided for years, it doesn't stop at the version that's been rehearsed. It goes further. It fills in what was left out. It drags the missing pieces back into focus. And when that happens, people talk. Not because they want to. Because they have to. You stopped at the canal, one of them said finally, voice low, steady. She gets out. She doesn't trust you. That's what you said. A small nod. Yes. And you stayed. Another pause. Yes. For how long? I don't know. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Because uncertainty is safer than detail. Long enough to see what happened, the detective replied. He didn't respond. Didn't correct it.
Didn't deny it.
The space tightened again. She didn't just walk away, the detective continued. We both know that. A shift in his posture.
Subtle.
But clear. You said she was scared. Said someone had been watching her, following her. Another pause. She gets into your car anyway.
Talks to you.
Then something changes. The words slowed. Deliberate. Something you did.
His jaw tightened. Barely.
But enough. I didn't. Something you said, the detective cut in gently, not raising his voice, just redirecting it. Something that made her realize she wasn't safe. The interruption landed. Because it didn't challenge him directly. It redefined the moment. Not as an accident, but as a shift. A realization.
She wanted out, the detective said.
Right there, right then.
A breath. Long.
Controlled. Then. She opened the door, he said quietly. The first crack. Small. But irreversible. They didn't react. Didn't lean in. Didn't acknowledge it as a breakthrough. Because that's how you keep it going. Then what? The detective asked. She got out. Fast. A hesitation. Then. Yes. The image began to form. Not from evidence. From him. She said something, the detective pressed. What did she say? Another pause. Longer this time. Because now the memory was specific.
Real.
And harder to reshape. She said, I wasn't helping, he said. Anything else? A shake of the head. But not convincing. She didn't trust you, the detective said. No response. She thought you were the one following her. That landed.
Hard.
Because it inverted everything. Turned his version against him. She was wrong, he said quickly. Too quickly. She was scared. She didn't know what she was saying. But she got out anyway. Silence. Because something didn't feel right. Another shift.
More visible now.
He leaned back slightly. Then forward again. As if trying to find a position that made this easier. There wasn't one. What happened after she got out? The detective asked. He swallowed. Looked at his hands. Then. I told her to wait. The words came slower. Heavier. I said I could still help. That she shouldn't be out there alone. And. She kept walking. The image sharpened. Dark road. Water nearby. A woman trying to create distance. And you stayed in the car? The detective asked. A pause.
No.
There it was. Another line crossed. I got out. The room shifted again. Because now he had placed himself outside the vehicle. On the ground. With her. You followed her. Not a question. A statement. A slow nod. Yes. Why? I just wanted to talk. The answer sounded hollow even as he said it. Because it didn't match the movement. Didn't match the escalation. You closed the distance, the detective said quietly.
No denial.
She told you to stop. Silence. You didn't.
A breath.
Uneven now. She turned around, he said. Angry. Afraid, the detective corrected. He didn't argue. Then what? The detective asked. The question hung there. Heavy. Because now they were at the edge of the moment. The point where everything changed. I grabbed her, he said. Barely above a whisper. But clear. Unmistakable. The room didn't react, didn't move. Because this was it. The beginning of the truth. Where? The detective asked. Her arm. Just her arm? A pause. Then she tried to pull away. Of course she did. And I held on. The words came faster now, less controlled. Because once memory starts moving, it doesn't stop neatly. She started yelling. I told her to stop. Told her I was just trying to help. The contradictions sat there, unresolved. She didn't believe you, the detective said.
No.
A beat. Then she tried to run. And you? I pulled her back. The scene unfolded piece by piece, each line closing the distance between what he claimed and what had actually happened. You used both hands, the detective said. Not a guess. A direction. He hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Where? Another pause. Longer. Because this was the line, the one that defined everything. He looked up for the first time in minutes. Not at them. Through them. As if the memory was somewhere behind their faces. Her shoulders, he said. Not yet. Not the truth. But closer. She fought you. A nod. Yes. And then silence again. But different now. Because this silence wasn't hiding anything. It was holding it. Right at the edge. Waiting. I didn't mean to.
He stopped.
Cut himself off. Too late. The words had already formed. Already pointed in one direction. The detectives didn't interrupt. Didn't push. Because now he was doing it himself. The story he had built for decades was breaking apart in real time.
Piece by piece.
Word by word. And what was underneath was no longer a question. It was a moment. Violent.
Close.
Unavoidable. And he was standing right inside it. Again. For the first time in years. With no way out. Because the next thing he said would define everything. Not just what happened that night, but who he had been all along. And the truth was already there. In his voice. In his pauses. In the space between what he had said and what he hadn't been able to keep hidden any longer. The moment he stopped speaking felt louder than anything he had said before. Not because the room changed. Not because the detectives moved. But because something inside him had reached its limit, and everyone present could feel it without a single word being spoken. The silence was no longer a tool of pressure from the outside. It was coming from him now. Heavy. Unstable. Loaded with something that had finally begun to surface. He stared at the table. Not at them. Not at the evidence. At nothing in particular, as if focusing on a fixed point might keep the rest of the memory from collapsing forward all at once. But it was too late for that. You pulled her back, the detective said softly, not breaking the rhythm, just guiding it. A slow nod. Yes. And she was trying to get away from you. Another nod. Yes. The words no longer carried resistance. They were fragments now, no longer protected by structure. Then what happened? A long pause. Long enough that it wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about reliving. I told her to stop screaming, he said finally. His voice had dropped. Lower. Less controlled. She wouldn't. The detective didn't interrupt. She was panicking. A correction formed in the air, but wasn't spoken. She thought I was going to hurt her. Silence. And you were close enough to grab her again, the detective said. A faint nod. Yes. Where this time? His jaw tightened. The answer didn't come immediately, because now the memory wasn't abstract. It had weight. It was her neck, he said. The room didn't react outwardly, but something shifted anyway, because this was no longer interpretation. This was confirmation of force. Tell us exactly what you did, the detective said. Not harsh. Not demanding. Just steady. Like a door opening a little further. I just tried to hold her still, he said. The phrasing was already slipping. Hold her still, the detective repeated. A pause. Then, she kept fighting, he added quickly. She wouldn't stop. And you tightened your grip. A statement. Not a question. A hesitation. Then a nod. Yes. The word landed differently this time, because there was no space left around it.
No ambiguity.
No alternative framing. Only action. And consequence. How long? The detective asked. I don't know. Seconds. A pause. Maybe. Long enough for her to stop moving? Silence. He didn't answer immediately. And that silence answered for him. The detectives didn't move. Didn't escalate. Because the moment was already doing what it needed to do. The story had reached its most unstable point. And now it would either break completely or resolve into something final. She went down, he said suddenly. The words rushed out. Not steady. Not planned.
She fell.
I didn't mean for it to go that far. The first attempt at separation. At distance. The classic fracture point. Where did she fall? The detective asked. Near the road, close to the canal. And she was alive. A pause. Yes. The confirmation mattered more than anything else so far. Because now the timeline locked into place. She was still alive when you let go, the detective said. He didn't respond. And then what happened? A long breath. Unsteady. I thought she was going to report me, he said. The shift was immediate. From action to justification. I panicked. The word came out fast. Almost automatic. The first true defense. She was injured, the detective said. Not a question. A statement grounded in evidence. And you were afraid she would go to the police. A nod. Yes. Silence returned. But this time it wasn't empty. It was crowded. With intent. With consequence. With the narrowing space between what had happened and what he was willing to admit. So you followed her, the detective said. Another pause. Yes. And she was trying to leave you. A nod. Yes. And she reached the canal. He hesitated. Longer than before. Because now the story had reached its final location. The place where there were no more transitions. Only ending. Yes, he said quietly. The word barely held shape. Tell us what happened there. This was it. The last step. No more framing. No more distancing. No more partial truth. Just the moment itself. He closed his eyes. Longer this time. When he opened them again, something had changed. Not clarity. Not peace. but resignation. She tried to get away, he said. I caught her again. Where? His voice broke slightly. Her upper body. And then silence.
Long. Deep.
Unavoidable. I lost control, he said. The phrase hit the room differently. Because it was an explanation. It was admission of collapse. What does that mean? The detective asked. A pause. Then, I couldn't stop her from screaming. The story was no longer linear. It was collapsing inward. And you held her again, the detective said. A nod. Yes. How long this time? I don't know. But the tone had changed. Because now he knew that I don't know was no longer enough. Not here. Not anymore. She stopped moving, the detective said quietly. A long silence followed. The kind that stretches too far to be comfortable. The kind that only exists when everyone in the room knows the answer before it is spoken. He nodded once.
Barely.
Yes. No justification followed.
No explanation.
Nothing to soften it. Just the moment. The consequence. The end of resistance. The detectives waited. Because even now, even after that admission, there were still layers left. Not of denial, but of ownership. After that, the detective said, "You put her in the canal." A pause.
Long.
Then, yes. The final confirmation. The last piece of movement. The last act that connected everything. The canal.
The body.
The silence that followed for decades. It was no longer a mystery in the room. It was a sequence.
A chain.
A truth that had finally stopped resisting discovery. He leaned back slightly, as if the act of saying it had drained something from him that couldn't be replaced. The detectives didn't celebrate, didn't react. Because this wasn't victory. It was completion. And completion always carries weight of its own. Outside the room, the world continued without knowing what had just shifted inside it. Inside, everything had changed. Because the man who had denied, deflected, and controlled every version of himself for years had finally reached the point where the story no longer belonged to him. And the silence that followed was no longer his to keep. The moment he stopped speaking felt louder than anything he had said before. Not because the room changed. Not because the detectives moved. But because something inside him had reached its limit, and everyone present could feel it without a single word being spoken. The silence was no longer a tool of pressure from the outside. It was coming from him now, heavy, unstable, loaded with something that had finally begun to surface. He stared at the table. Not at them. Not at the evidence. At nothing in particular, as if focusing on a fixed point might keep the rest of the memory from collapsing forward all at once. But it was too late for that. You pulled her back, the detective said softly, not breaking the rhythm, just guiding it. A slow nod. Yes. And she was trying to get away from you. Another nod. Yes. The words no longer carried resistance. They were fragments now, no longer protected by structure. Then what happened? A long pause. Long enough that it wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about reliving. I told her to stop screaming, he said finally. His voice had dropped. Lower. Less controlled. She wouldn't. The detective didn't interrupt. She was panicking. A correction formed in the air, but wasn't spoken. She thought I was going to hurt her. Silence. And you were close enough to grab her again, the detective said. A faint nod. Yes. Where this time? His jaw tightened. The answer didn't come immediately, because now the memory wasn't abstract. It had weight. It was her neck, he said. The room didn't react outwardly, but something shifted anyway, because this was no longer interpretation. This was confirmation of force. Tell us exactly what you did, the detective said. Not harsh. Not demanding. Just steady. Like a door opening a little further. I just try to hold her still, he said. The phrasing was already slipping. Hold her still, the detective repeated. A pause. Then, she kept fighting, he added quickly. She wouldn't stop. And you tightened your grip. A statement. Not a question. A hesitation. Then a nod. Yes. The word landed differently this time, because there was no space left around it.
No ambiguity.
No alternative framing. Only action. And consequence. How long? The detective asked. I don't know. Seconds. A pause. Maybe. Long enough for her to stop moving? Silence. He didn't answer immediately. And that silence answered for him. The detectives didn't move. Didn't escalate. Because the moment was already doing what it needed to do. The story had reached its most unstable point. And now it would either break completely or resolve into something final. She went down, he said suddenly. The words rushed out. Not steady. Not planned.
She fell.
I didn't mean for it to go that far. The first attempt at separation. At distance. The classic fracture point. Where did she fall? The detective asked. Near the road, close to the canal. And she was alive. A pause. Yes. The confirmation mattered more than anything else so far. Because now the timeline locked into place. She was still alive when you let go, the detective said. He didn't respond. And then what happened? A long breath. Unsteady. I thought she was going to report me, he said. The shift was immediate. From action to justification. I panicked. The word came out fast. Almost automatic. The first true defense. She was injured, the detective said. Not a question. A statement grounded in evidence. And you were afraid she would go to the police. A nod. Yes. Silence returned. But this time it wasn't empty. It was crowded. With intent. With consequence. With the narrowing space between what had happened and what he was willing to admit. So you followed her, the detective said. Another pause. Yes. And she was trying to leave you. A nod. Yes. And she reached the canal. He hesitated. Longer than before. Because now the story had reached its final location. The place where there were no more transitions. Only ending. Yes, he said quietly. The word barely held shape. Tell us what happened there. This was it. The last step. No more framing. No more distancing. No more partial truth. Just the moment itself. He closed his eyes. Longer this time. When he opened them again, something had changed. Not clarity. Not peace. But resignation. She tried to get away, he said. I caught her again. Where? His voice broke slightly. Her upper body. And then,
Silence. Long. Deep.
Unavoidable. I lost control, he said. The phrase hit the room differently. Because it was an explanation. It was admission of collapse. What does that mean? The detective asked. A pause. Then, I couldn't stop her from screaming. The story was no longer linear. It was collapsing inward. And you held her again, the detective said. A nod. Yes. How long this time? I don't know. But the tone had changed. Because now he knew that I don't know was no longer enough. Not here. Not anymore. She stopped moving, the detective said quietly. A long silence followed. The kind that stretches too far to be comfortable. The kind that only exists when everyone in the room knows the answer before it is spoken. He nodded once.
Barely.
Yes. No justification followed.
No explanation.
Nothing to soften it. Just the moment. The consequence. The end of resistance. The detectives waited. Because even now, even after that admission, there were still layers left. Not of denial, but of ownership. After that, the detective said, "You put her in the canal." A pause.
Long.
Then, yes. The final confirmation. The last piece of movement. The last act that connected everything. The canal.
The body.
The silence that followed for decades. It was no longer a mystery in the room. It was a sequence.
A chain.
A truth that had finally stopped resisting discovery. He leaned back slightly, as if the act of saying it had drained something from him that couldn't be replaced. The detectives didn't celebrate. Didn't react. Because this wasn't victory. It was completion. And completion always carries weight of its own. Outside the room, the world continued without knowing what had just shifted inside it. Inside, everything had changed. Because the man who had denied, deflected, and controlled every version of himself for years had finally reached the point where the story no longer belonged to him. And the silence that followed was no longer his to keep. After the confession, the room didn't change immediately. There was no sudden movement, no immediate rush to document, no dramatic release of tension like the end of a film. Instead, everything slowed further, as if the air itself needed time to understand what had just been spoken aloud. He sat there differently now. Not relaxed. Not relieved. Just emptied in a way that didn't yet have words attached to it. The detectives didn't speak right away. One of them reached for the recorder, confirmed the time, confirmed the statement, then set it back down. Procedure continued even when emotion didn't. Because confessions like this are not endings. They are openings into consequences. Finally, one of them broke the silence. Do you understand what you've just said? A long pause. He nodded.
Barely.
Yes. The word no longer carried resistance. It was acceptance of structure returning around him. Do you want to clarify anything? The detective asked. Another pause. He looked down at his hands. Fingers no longer moving.
No.
That was it. No attempt to reshape it. No return to earlier versions. Just silence where denial used to be. The detectives exchanged a glance, subtle but meaningful. Not celebration. Not satisfaction. Something more procedural. More contained. A case that had lived in file boxes for decades had finally shifted into a different category entirely.
Real.
Actionable. Closed in one direction, but now opening in others. They left him alone in the room for a moment. Not as punishment, but because the space itself had changed. The interrogation room, which had once been a pressure chamber, now felt different. The same walls, the same lights, but the dynamic was gone. There was nothing left to extract in that moment. Only documentation. Only verification. Only the transition from spoken truth to recorded truth. In the hallway, the detective spoke quietly. No raised voices.
No excitement.
Just confirmation of what had been achieved. A decades-old, unidentified homicide had a name.
A timeline.
A confirmed suspect. A confession. But even then, nothing felt finished. Because cases like this don't end when the truth is spoken. They end when the truth is accepted everywhere else. The paperwork began immediately. Statements transcribed. Evidence, logs updated. Chain of custody reinforced. Every detail revisited, not because it was in doubt anymore, but because it now needed to stand in court, under scrutiny, under challenge. The system didn't care that the truth had been revealed. It cared that it could be proven. Hours passed before he was moved again. When he finally stood, it was without resistance.
No struggle. No hesitation.
The same controlled presence he had entered with, now stripped of its purpose. Outside the interrogation room, the world felt too bright. Fluorescent lights in the hallway were harsher than before. The noise of the station louder. Phones ringing, printers running, footsteps moving with direction now that the case had shifted from uncertainty to process. He was escorted down the corridor.
No dramatic scenes.
No public exposure. Just movement from one controlled space to another. But somewhere within that movement, something shifted again. Not in him. In the case itself. Because once a confession exists, it spreads. To supervisors. To prosecutors. To cold case units that had carried the file for years without resolution. And then, eventually, to the original investigators who had once stood at a canal in Florida in 1998, staring at a body they could not name. Now that body had a name. And a story. The lead detective who had reopened the file sat alone later that night, reviewing everything again. Not because he needed confirmation anymore, but because the weight of completion doesn't settle easily. Photos. Reports. The diner witness statement. The gas station footage. The abandoned vehicle record. The DNA match. The confession. Each piece now fit into a structure that had once been invisible. A structure that had always been there. Just unseen. He paused on the image of the canal. Still water. Still seen. A moment frozen for over 20 years. He thought about how many times the file had been opened and closed before technology caught up. How many times it had been labeled unsolvable. How many names had been absent from that body for so long that absence itself had become the identity. And now, it was resolved. But resolution doesn't erase impact. It only changes its form. The next day, confirmation procedures began. Formal statements were reviewed again. His confession was replayed, transcribed, verified against known facts. Details aligned in ways that made denial impossible. The timeline matched. The geography matched. The forensic evidence matched what he had finally admitted. Everything pointed in one direction. And stayed there. The victim's family was contacted again. This time not with uncertainty, but with confirmation. There are no simple ways to deliver that kind of message, even when it ends ambiguity, especially then, because clarity doesn't erase years of not knowing. It only reframes them. The call was short, careful, measured. But the impact was not. For them, the name that had been restored in Part 2 of the investigation now carried weight that had never been possible before. Not just identity, but resolution. Not just a missing person, but a completed case. Somewhere in Florida, the canal no longer held a mystery. But it still held memory. That same evening, investigators returned briefly to the site. Not for evidence. Not for procedure. Just presence. The water was still. The reeds unchanged. Traffic nearby continued as if nothing had ever happened there. But for those who stood at the edge, it was different now. Because places do not forget what happens in them. They only stop being watched. One of the detectives spoke quietly. He was here for all those years, he said. The other nodded. And no one knew. That was the part that stayed with them the most. Not the violence. Not even the confession. But the silence that followed it for decades. A silence so complete it became part of the landscape. Back at the station, the case file was officially reclassified. No longer cold. No longer unresolved. A completed homicide investigation. But the folder didn't get smaller. It got heavier. Because closure in paperwork is not the same as closure in memory. That night, the lead detective locked the file away again, but not in the same way it had been stored before. This time, it wasn't waiting for answers. It was documentation of one. And as he turned off the light in the office, there was a final thought that stayed with him longer than the rest. The case hadn't just been solved. It had been carried. For decades. By people who never knew its full shape. Until the silence finally broke. And once it did, it never went back to what it was before. There are cases that end with a verdict. And there are cases that end with something quieter. This one ended in a silence that felt different from the one that had surrounded it for decades. That earlier silence had been absence, missing answers, missing identity, missing direction. This new silence was something else entirely. It was the absence of uncertainty. It had been replaced by knowledge, by truth, by consequence. The man no longer sat in the interrogation room. The chair he had occupied for hours now sat empty, the faint imprint of his presence already fading into routine cleanup and procedural reset. The room itself looked unchanged, same walls, same light, same camera in the corner, but the function of the space had shifted forever. It was no longer a place of discovery. It was now a place of record. Down the hallway, the case moved through its final institutional stages. Reports finalized. Evidence sealed. Statements signed. Verified. Time-stamped. Each document carried the same weight. Confirmation that what had once been a question mark in a file cabinet was now a concluded homicide investigation. Florida, 1998. Unidentified female. Now restored identity. Now resolved cause. Now confirmed suspect. But even in resolution, nothing about it felt clean. Because truth, once exposed after decades of delay, doesn't arrive neatly. It arrives all at once, and then lingers in pieces. The detectives who had reopened the file didn't speak much that day. There was no celebration, no relief in the way people imagine from television narratives. Instead, there was fatigue. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long and finally setting it down, only to realize the weight has changed shape, not disappeared. One of them stood near the evidence board for a long time, staring at the timeline they had built. Gas station. Diner.
Canal.
3 points that had once been disconnected noise now formed a straight, undeniable line. And in the center of it all, a woman who had once been unknown to the world. Now returned to it. The victim's family was notified again, this time formally, with documentation and confirmation. There were no easy words for it. No structure that makes the moment feel complete. Just the reality that after more than 2 decades, the unknown had finally been given shape. Some answers don't heal. They only end guessing. And sometimes that is its own kind of weight. In another part of the building, the man who had once controlled the narrative of that night sat alone in a holding room awaiting transfer. No longer interrogated. No longer asked. The questions had ended. What remained now was classification, processing, the transition from suspect to defendant. He did not speak. not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been taken from him in pieces. First by evidence, then by timeline, then by his own words, and finally by the silence that followed confession. The system no longer needed his version of events. It had one that was supported in every direction: forensic, testimonial, digital, biological. The story he had tried to shape for decades no longer had space to exist. Outside, Florida continued as if nothing had changed. The canals still cut through the land. The roads still carried traffic past places where no one knew what had once happened. Time had not reversed. It had only caught up. Later that evening, one of the investigators returned to the original file room, not for procedure, not for assignment, just to see it again in its final state. The box that had once been labeled unknown now carried new markings: updated identity, confirmed victim, closed investigation. He opened it one last time. The photographs were the same. The canal, the reeds, the still water. But they no longer represented uncertainty. They represented a moment that had been fully accounted for. A life interrupted, then recovered in memory. A crime once suspended in ambiguity, now anchored in fact. He closed the box slowly. Not because it was over, but because it had changed form. Cold cases don't disappear when solved. They remain. But they stop asking questions. And that, in itself, is what separates silence from resolution. The next morning, internal reports circulated through the department summarizing the case closure. Official language, structured phrasing, clean terminology. It read like any other resolved homicide file. But no one who had touched it believed it was just another case. Because they had seen what it actually was. A timeline that had waited 20 years to be understood. A victim who had waited just as long to be named again. And a truth that had survived not because it was hidden well, but because no one had yet been able to see it fully. Now it had been seen. And nothing about it could return to what it was before. At the canal, there was no marker of what had happened. No sign. No memorial. Just water moving slowly under Florida light, indifferent to what it had once held. But for those who knew, the place had changed anyway. Not physically. Not visibly. But permanently in meaning. Because some locations do not keep secrets forever. They only wait for someone to finally ask the right questions. And when they do, the past answers. Not gently. Not quietly. But completely. And in that completion, there is no longer a mystery to solve. Only a story that had been waiting too long to be told.